Hey everyone, Chef Scott here for Devil's Food Kitchen. Today we are making pie dough. Who doesn't love pie? Lots of people actually don't love pie, but not me, not you. So we're in good shape here making a little bit of pie dough. Pie dough is a really simple recipe, but it takes a couple little tricks to get it just right and get it just right all of the time. And once you know those tricks, you'll be able to adjust your pie dough to exactly what you want. So let's get some stuff measured out and we'll get started. I want to talk for just a minute about the ingredients in the pie dough and what they do. I think that's really important information for someone to have, especially if you're going to troubleshoot a recipe at home. But if you're just interested in the method, that's okay. You can go ahead and skip to that now. Now we're going to be using all butter for our pie dough. And I know there are a lot of people out there that swear by lard or shortening. I've always preferred an all butter crust. And that's for a few different reasons. Number one, I think the flavor profile of butter is better than lard, or certainly for shortening, which doesn't have much flavor at all. But just as important, butter has water in it, and that water plays a big role in creating flakiness in a baked pie crust. If you've ever had an all lard crust, it's usually denser and tighter and can even be a little bit greasy. Now, if you've grown up making lard crusts, I don't think I'm going to necessarily change your mind. Although I would encourage you to experiment with butter and lard to just know the differences between the two. And lots of people who do like some of the characteristics of a lard crust create a hybrid with some butter in it. But I've always been an all butter person for my pie dough. And butter is the real key to perfecting pie dough and getting it to just the right flake that you want. We're going to talk about that in a minute. We're also going to use pastry flour as opposed to all-purpose flour. If you only have all-purpose flour, that's fine. You can use it. Your pie dough will be just fine. Nobody's going to spit it out. But the pastry flour has a little bit less protein content, which means a little less gluten development, and that's a good thing. We don't want a lot of gluten developing in our pie crust because that'll create a whole stretchy, kind of gummy, chewy texture that we don't want. We're going to have salt and sugar in there. Not a lot, just enough to give some browning and a little bit of flavor balance. But of course, you could adjust the salt or sugar to your personal preferences if you wanted something a little saltier or a little sweeter. We're also going to add white vinegar to our dough. And don't worry, you're not going to taste that at all in the baked product. But the acid in the vinegar is going to help reduce shrinking of the dough when we're baking it. Last, a little bit of cold water, and I'll explain what that's for as well. And we're ready to get started. Thanks to the magic of video, we have everything scaled out already. And if I happen to use that term again, scaling is kind of the industry kitchen term for measuring. So I got everything measured. Now I have my flour already measured into my mixing bowl. I hate doing dishes, so I don't want to put this in a separate bowl just to add it here. It's not sifted and it doesn't need to be sifted. I've also got my salt and sugar in equal measure here, and I'm just going to add that to my flour. We're going to use a paddle attachment in our mixer. It's really important how we add the butter and what shape and size the butter is in the final dough. The paddle is going to do the best job of creating that size. If you don't have a stand mixer, you could always use a hand pastry cutter. That'll work just fine as well. I'll give this about 2 seconds just of mixing to get the salt and sugar incorporated evenly in the dough. That's really all we need. I also have my water here. Now I've kept this in the refrigerator until right now. We want to keep this as cold as possible up until we add it to our dough. I have my vinegar. If you were going to measure this vinegar out way in advance for some reason, make sure to cover it because it will evaporate and then your measurement won't be correct. And then of course I've got the butter, and this is the most important part. Now I'm using unsalted butter. I always use unsalted butter because I want to control how much salt I'm actually adding in my recipe. We've got one stick already cut up, but I'm going to cut this other stick to show you a good way to get a quick dice. So since we're using these handy sticks, it's already in a rectangle shape. I'm just going to cut this in half and then cut each of those slices in half again, and it will kind of give me 4 little sticks here. And then from there, I'm going to cut that into a rough dice. Now, I personally am looking for about a 1/2 inch dice for my butter. It doesn't have to be exact, you don't need a ruler, but I think this is a really good size. to get the type of flake that I'm looking for in a dough. And as I mentioned before, the butter is the crucial ingredient in your pie dough. What's going to happen is this butter is going to get incorporated into the dough and it will break down. Some of it will break down completely into the flour, but a lot of it is going to stay intact in these little chunks. When we go ahead and bake the dough, those chunks of butter will melt out, leaving a little pocket cavity within the dough. And that cavity is going to start to rise as the water in the butter turns to steam. That's why I like having the water in the fat. Those little pockets will all increase in size, and that's what creates your flake. So the larger the chunk of butter in your dough, the larger the flakes are going to be, and the more delicate the dough will be as well. If I just put this butter in huge chunks, I would get a really wide open flaky crust, but it would fall apart. It would be almost like a puff pastry. And if I let the dough completely incorporate, I wouldn't have any chunks at all, and then we'd have more of a sweet dough or a tart dough. So I've done a lot of practicing with this, and I think that the 1/2 inch size of butter gives you just the right size of chunks when the dough's all finished to get a perfect flake. It's going to be nice and tender, really flaky, but still have enough structure that you can cut it without falling apart. So all we're going to do is add our cold butter, and we want it to be cold so that it stays in chunks, into our mixing bowl as we're mixing. Now, I don't normally use these safety guards, but this can come in handy right now because these cold chunks of butter can make flour fly all over the place, which is kind of annoying, not fun to clean up. So I'm just going to put this on slow speed, and we're going to add our butter a little at a time, but not too slowly because we want everything to kind of mix in the same level. And then we're ready for the next step. Once I've added all of my butter, I can remove this guard. And now I'm just watching for the right breakdown of the butter in the dough. All right, so this is mixed for just a couple minutes. And we've got lots of good chunks here. Just the right size. That's about as big as I would ever want a chunk of butter in the dough. And I can feel that the dough is really still nice and cold. The butter's nice and cold, so that's great. We're in good shape. So far, off to a good start. Now we're going to add our liquid, and it's just as simple as adding it in as we mix. I'm going to add the vinegar first, and then the cold water, all at once. And I'm going to let that just come together. I don't want this to bind too tightly. And you can hear in the mixer starting to struggle a little bit as the dough comes together. And that's it. So here we can see the dough is very short. It has just come together. It's still quite dry and quite crumbly. That's perfect. That's what we want. We don't want any gluten development. Gluten development in this case would be a bad thing. So I'm going to finish this off by hand. It's really hard to overmix something by hand, and it's really easy to do it on a mixer. I'm just going to carefully work this dough out of the bowl so it doesn't go everywhere. And if I've got a little bit of dry material at the bottom of the bowl, I'm going to get that as well. And now I'm simply going to bring this together by hand, just until it holds a shape. Now remember, your hands are really warm, and if they're like mine, they're really warm. So I want to work with this as little as possible. So there we have the dough just bound together, and you can see the cracks. It's still very short, and you might be thinking to yourself, how are we going to roll this dough out? How are we going to work with this? But we're not done yet. We need to chill the dough. We need to let it rest. We need to let all of the water that's in there right now do its thing and hydrate the dough. And in a couple of hours, this will be ready to work. So I have some plastic wrap here. You'll notice that I've worked the dough into a round shape, and that's because chances are that's the shape we're going to use for our final product. And now I'm just going to press it down. Again, to make rolling easier, there's no reason to make this harder than it needs to be. If I'm going to be working a round shape in the future anyway, might as well give myself a head start while the dough is nice and easy to work with. This also increases the surface area of the dough, which will help it cool faster. And you can see chunks of butter here. That's a good thing. That's going to be flakiness when this dough is baked. So there you have it. The pie dough is done. We are all cleaned up, which is my least favorite part of any recipe, and the dough is in the fridge. Now I would leave that dough to rest in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours up to overnight. Realistically, I don't ever work with the dough until it's been resting for 8 to 12 hours. I just think it gives you a better result. So just to recap the tips of this recipe, remember we're using unsalted butter and cutting it to a 1/2 inch cube. We want to keep that butter cold through the entire process, so use cold butter and use cold water. We want to handle the dough as little as possible because we don't want to overmix and create gluten, and we don't want our warm hands warming up the dough. And we want to make sure that we rest the dough so that it has time to hydrate and relax. If you follow those steps, I promise your recipe will come out great every single time. I hope you enjoyed the video and give the recipe a try. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all of that, and turn on notifications so that you never miss another video. Until next time, I'm Chef Scott for Devil's Food Kitchen.
But I wasn't grown up